The Rundown, Part 9, A Farlost Story by John Miro.
Twilight fell upon the darkening road. I found myself again alone. Street lights went out by one, by two, by three. Now reveled in the shadows that had grown. Yes, I reveled in the darkness I had known.
Locklaw Police Inspector Nicodemus Usher was dying. In fact, he was dying in exactly the way he had always feared. With no possible way to change his fate, Nick found a strange peace as he plummeted, enveloped in a warm current of air, towards the surface of Casti. His life didn't exactly flash before his eyes so much as sign and seal itself as complete and release his mind from panic to enjoy his last moments. He didn't even dwell on the fact that it was Casti's poison atmosphere tickling his lungs now, not Sky City air, or that in minutes he would be coughing blood. He didn't even mull the eternal debate that always grabbed him after one too many drinks, whether he would stay conscious long enough to feel it when he was crushed descending into Casti's pressured depths. He didn't do any of that. He just stared in awe at a view few people would ever have firsthand. The pier was already stories above. He smiled up at it, admiring scorch marks and holes in the bottom of it that no one ever got a chance to see. Perhaps his father had destroyed one of the ships that left those very wounds during the Civil War. He'd have to remember to ask. He'd be seeing him soon. Shouldn't be long now, he thought. His eyes began to water from the warm wind buffeting him, and he started to tumble. He ignored the pains in his body and watched the city wall hurtle past. He could pick out a few of the rich people's private balconies glinting far off in reflected sunlight, but he ignored them. Instead, he stared at the wall itself, grown thousands of years ago, over 2 kilometers tall, majestic once-living matter, tougher than the alloy of most of the ships that docked here. He could even make out the patterns of growth in the walls from here. What a sight up close. Nick laughed dizzily. He'd get to see it from below soon enough, too. The laugh turned into a jagged cough. He ignored the burning in his chest and stared at the city rushing past. Locklaw was a beautiful place. He'd seen what other people called home all across Farlost. He was proud of his father for fighting to make the city free. What the hell, he admitted he was proud of himself, too, for keeping the faith with the law when the bribes were offered, for carrying the protection of the law to dock workers and widowed wives and store owners who usually never saw it. He loved this city. He was proud to have served her. If he had to die, he laughed and coughed and laughed again. Well, what a way to go. Then the wind changed its mind. Nick screamed as a scalding updraft slammed into his back, burning his neck and the back of his hands. He rocketed back upwards, far faster than he had fallen, seeing stars, coughing, his limbs singing with pain from the rough hand of the wind. Then he was above the pier again, staring down, way down, wide-eyed and panicked as the outcropping of metal cut off the wind, and suddenly Nick was falling hard and fast. His body sledgehammered onto the pier. He heard a crack in his right shoulder. Instantly, that whole arm went numb. The wind ate his retching scream as he spun across the pier like a top. Still hurtling upwards of 40 kilometers an hour, he slammed into one of the caged navigation lights dotting the pier's surface. Ribs broke as he tumbled over and past. The impact bled off tens of kilometers of acceleration, but kept him spinning towards the edge. His vision was a tiny sliver of bright light in a tunnel of black, but he did see. He was hurtling toward one of the railings he'd activated earlier. Just one railing, between himself and empty sky. Again. He clenched his right arm and both legs around the railing when he hit. The wind screamed louder than Nick could manage. Perhaps it was angry that he held on, he thought dizzily. Then the whine faded, as the wind suddenly dropped away completely. Nick sank to the ground, falling on his right shoulder. He pushed air through his raw throat, a silent scream, and dry heaved in the grip of the pain. Then another sound crowded his head, the rumble of a cargo hauler's engines. Nick fought through the pain and opened his eyes to slits. He saw Roland halfway down Dock H towards the hauler. The gunman who'd shot Willer down hadn't noticed him, Nick realized. Nick turned his head to see Willer a few hundred meters away, wings bobbing as an after effect of the disappearing wind. The ruin of the cockpit was still smoking, and Nick imagined he could see the insides of his partner sprayed on the wall. Pesh! A rage grabbed him, and he snarled back at the hauler. Bird was only a dozen feet away now, making better time in the eerie stillness. They must have entered the eye of the storm. Soon, the swirling vortex would crash into the pier again. Willer, unsecured, would plummet below, to be crushed and lost forever. Roland Bird would be away by then, rocketing straight up in the cargo hauler past the grip of Casty's winds. And Nick would be swept away to finish his interrupted death. No, he rasped in a tiny voice that couldn't hold all the rage that was brewing inside Inspector Nicodemus Usher. He scanned the deck and saw a yellow box outline, another surface locker. He untangled his feet, ignoring crunching in both knees and a lick of fire in one Achilles tendon. He dragged himself along by one hand and one functioning foot, white-knuckling a grip on each small D-shaped indentation in the deck. 6 small grooves in the hull led to the surface locker. 6 agonizing draws of his leg to fit a boot into each indentation, 6 trembling reaches with his one working hand. Then he slammed his fist into the mechanical release, and the hydraulics raised the door upwards. Nick tumbled into the hole and automatically clipped himself onto the first safety line he could find. Only then did he turn to check on Roland Bird's progress. He was only feet away from the open door in the side of the cargo hauler. The other form waiting there was another human. Nick's blurry vision could tell him that much. Nick pulled up the transparent cover on the comms panel to pound in his authorization code. "Pier control," he gasped, not recognizing the sounds his throat was making as his voice. "Initiate control circuit with Willer." He had to focus hard to punch in the secondary code he'd programmed in the event he'd ever needed remote access to his ship. But he got the number right, and his own undamaged voice came out of the comms panel. "You've got Willer," the voice said, casual, relaxed, and ignorant of the drama unfolding. He whipped his head back around. "Emergency forward thrust, full burn." Nick never imagined giving that order in an atmosphere. Never imagined he'd be outside the ship at the time to watch. Never imagined he'd snarl like an animal as he rammed his beloved ship into a cargo hauler to kill sentience. He didn't know who else was in that ship, and in that split second, he didn't much care. Every muscle in his body tensed painfully as he watched the air behind Willer turn orange. He forced the spasming in his lungs to stop for just a moment so he could watch this, so he could savor Pesha's revenge. Roland was jumping into the air above the dock, and the gunman was capturing his wrist in both hands and swinging him aboard when Willer drove itself into the side of the hauler on the far side of the cargo door between Roland and his accomplice and the ship's main engine. Willer sliced through the ship like a hot knife through Roland's stomach and kept on going as explosions ballooned in the hauler's engine section. Nick whooped as the hauler began to bob. The eye of the storm passed right then, and the wind returned just as the exploding hauler keeled over onto its side. The renewed winds grabbed the top of the hauler and sent it soaring far away from the dock. A moment too late. Nick's cheers died in his throat as he watched Roland and his accomplice tumble out of the hauler's open door as the ship listed. He screamed, "No, no!" and slammed his one working hand into the wall of the surface locker as the two killers grabbed onto a railing as the wind sent their escape ship tumbling up, and away. He didn't spare the hauler a single look as it exploded, turning the sky orange with fire and black with smoke, chunks hurtling up and away before sinking down into Casty's gravity. No, his eyes were on Roland, dragging himself and the other form through winds twice what Nick had endured, hand over hand to another hatch and inside. He screamed at them as Roland hauled his partner inside the open hatch. and screamed again when the other form disappeared completely into the black space. That was no shallow surface locker. That was an access tunnel. With the pier on weather lockdown, it would take just a little more luck for Roland Bird to escape on foot into the city. Nick roared more pain, then thought of the ship his dad had left him. He shouted more emergency orders into the comms and spared a glance for Willer in time to see her execute his instructions, her aerodynamic nose cutting through the wind to land right alongside the surface locker he was huddled in. He keyed emergency netting to snare the ship fast and knew that if Willer could survive being thrown like a spear through the cargo hauler, it would survive the worst the storm could throw at it now. Exhausted and feeling things the word pain couldn't begin to cover, Nick looked back into the still-open access tunnel Bird had used and saw the man, still perched there. Roland Bird had waited to meet Nick's eyes. Nick stared, raging and disbelieving, as Bird cocked a finger to shoot at Nick, laughing as he only then disappeared. Nick shouted and spat and punched the walls of the locker until what was left of his vision began to fade. With the last of his strength, he fit an air mask on his face and punched the hydraulics to close the locker door. Police screamed into the tiny enclosed space that they were coming as Nick collapsed in his whistling little box, shaking in the wind, sobbing for his friend and cursing Roland Bird. Even beaten and passing out, Nick Usher was a detective. His mind had already begun connecting the dots. He cursed Roland Bird again, Roland Bird, and whoever had engineered his escape. He'd find them and make them pay. You have been listening to The Rundown, a Farlost story, written by John Miro. Learn more at servingworlds.com. Opening music, Everything Is Not What It Appears, kindly provided by Nate Maingard at natemaingard.com. Closing music, Full On by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. If you like what you hear, you can become a patron and support more stories at patreon.com/servingworlds. Thanks for listening. See you next week.